They told you Rome was built by marble-skinned emperors in togas. They told you Africa was a colony, not a cradle. But what if I told you that one of Rome's greatest emperors was African, born of the sands, not the Senate? His name was Septimius Severus, the Black Caesar who ruled an empire that stretched from Scotland to Syria, the man who rode out of Africa with the desert sun on his back and conquered the greatest power on earth. But Rome doesn't like to remember him that way, because Severus didn't fit the story they wanted to tell. He wasn't a Caesar of marble, he was a Caesar of obsidian. He was born in Leptis Magna, in what is now Libya, an African city of wealth and sophistication. It wasn't the dusty outpost of stereotypes, it was a coastal jewel of the Roman world. Markets overflowed with gold, olive oil, glass, and grain. The streets were carved with mosaics that glimmered in the sunlight. Its people were merchants, engineers, and scholars, Africans who spoke Latin, traded with Egypt, and built monuments that still stand today. And in that world, Severus was born into power. His family wasn't enslaved or forgotten, they were part of the elite. His father, Publius Septimius Geta, and his mother, Fulvia Pia, came from noble African lineages that had integrated into Roman high society. They were citizens, yes, but they were Africans first. As a young man, Severus didn't dream of being emperor, he dreamed of survival. Rome was ruthless. To rise, you needed ambition carved from iron and patience sharper than a blade, and Severus had both. He studied law in Rome, learned rhetoric, philosophy, and the art of command, but even in the Senate, whispers followed him. The African, the provincial, the outsider. They said it with contempt. He wore it like armor. When chaos struck Rome after Emperor Commodus's death, the empire fractured. Generals fought generals, cities burned, legions turned against their own, and out of that chaos, out of the dust of Africa, came Severus. In 193 AD, his troops proclaimed him emperor, not the Senate, not the nobles, his soldiers. The men who had fought beside him, bled beside him, believed in him. When he marched on Rome, the elites mocked him, but by the time he arrived, they were kneeling. The black man from Africa now wore the crown of the Caesars. He was the first emperor to bring Africa to the heart of Rome. He filled the city with architects and artisans from Leptis Magna, importing the grandeur of the Sahara into the eternal city. The marble of his hometown rebuilt the forums, his engineers redesigned the harbors, his African soldiers guarded the throne. Rome became an empire ruled not just over Africa, but by Africa. But that truth didn't age well. Centuries later, when European historians wrote their grand tales of Rome's glory, they painted its emperors white, pale marble, cold perfection. They wrote about Julius Caesar, Augustus, Nero, Constantine. But Severus, the African emperor who rebuilt their empire, his story was dimmed, sanded down, whitewashed like the statues they scrubbed clean. When they found portraits of him, his skin dark, his hair curled tight, they called it artistic exaggeration. When they found records of his Libyan heritage, they called it ambiguous, because a black emperor didn't fit their myth of Europe's pure lineage. But the stones still remember. In Leptis Magna, the arches Severus built still rise toward the sky, carved with the faces of African gods beside Roman eagles. In Britain, the ruins of his forts still stand, where he led his armies across the misty frontier. The man they erased left footprints that never faded, and that's just the beginning. Because Septimius Severus wasn't the only one. From the deserts of Nubia to the palaces of Rome, Africans shaped the empire's destiny. Generals, emperors, queens, and priests whose names history tried to bury under white marble. But their blood still flows through the empire's veins. And once you see them, once you uncover what was hidden, Rome never looks the same again. Before the crown, before the wars, before Rome trembled at his name, Severus was just a man with a dream, born in a place most Romans considered the edge of the world. Leptis Magna wasn't some forgotten corner of Africa, it was alive. Palm trees lined its streets, markets sang with the rhythm of trade, and ships from across the Mediterranean carried goods stamped with the mark of African hands. Gold from Ghana, glass from Alexandria, ivory from Nubia, everything flowed through Leptis like blood through an artery. That's where Severus learned the meaning of empire, not from the marble steps of the Senate, but from the dust and heat of an African city that was Rome on its own terms. He watched caravans arrive from the Sahara, laden with salt and slaves, and he understood power wasn't about race or geography, it was about control. The desert and the sea were both empires, and only those who could master both would rule the world. When he left for Rome, Severus was young, hungry. The empire didn't hand him opportunity, he carved it out piece by piece. He served as a lawyer, a soldier, a governor. He learned to navigate the politics of a city that smiled while it stabbed. His dark skin and African accent made him a target of whispers in the marble halls, but he never bent. Every insult became another layer of armor, and Rome couldn't help but notice. The African was efficient, cold, unflinching. When others schemed for favor, Severus delivered results. He governed the provinces of Gaul and Sicily with discipline. He put down rebellions, managed armies, and turned chaos into order. Rome rewarded him because it had no choice, but Rome didn't love him. It used him until he became too powerful to ignore. Then came 1903 AD, the year of the 5 emperors. Rome was in flames, not from fire, but from ambition. After Emperor Pertinax was assassinated, the throne was literally auctioned off to the highest bidder by the Praetorian Guard. Yes, the empire that once ruled the known world sold its crown like a trinket in the marketplace, but the provinces didn't play along. From Britain to the Danube, legions began proclaiming their own emperors, military men, not politicians. And in the African provinces, the legions shouted one name, Septimius Severus. He didn't seize the title, he earned it. When he rode north with his African army, soldiers from Egypt, Numidia, and Libya, Rome trembled. He was bringing the desert to the Tiber. His banners bore not the olive branch of peace, but the lion of Africa, roaring for justice and order. By the time he reached Rome, the Senate's puppet emperor had fled. The gates opened. The African general entered the eternal city, not as an invader, but as its savior. The crowd watched as he rode through the forum, his armor glinting gold, his skin dark under the Mediterranean sun. To the Romans, he looked like a god from their own mythology, Mars reborn, or perhaps something older, something they couldn't categorize. He became Emperor Septimius Severus, ruler of an empire built on conquest and contradiction, and the first thing he did was rewrite the rules. He purged the corrupt Praetorian Guard, the very men who'd sold the throne, replacing them with loyal African and Danubian soldiers. He expanded the Senate, giving power to provincial elites. He sent word to Leptis Magna, prepare to build. Soon, ship after ship crossed the sea from Africa to Rome, bringing architects, artists, and craftsmen from his homeland. They didn't just restore his city, they remade it. Leptis Magna became a new Rome, grander, warmer, touched by the African sun. He wasn't content with ruling an empire. He wanted to reshape it, to make Rome look like him. But power brings enemies. The old guard, senators born in marble villas, whispered that Rome had fallen to a foreigner. They couldn't stomach an emperor whose mother's tongue carried the rhythm of Africa. To them, Severus wasn't Roman. He was a threat wrapped in a laurel crown. They called him the Moor, not as praise, but as poison. And yet he ruled, because when his enemies conspired in shadows, Severus answered with legions. When the Senate hesitated, he commanded. He didn't need their approval. He had Rome's loyalty where it mattered most, the army. He was no longer the boy from Leptis Magna. He was Caesar, and Rome was learning a lesson it would never forget, that the empire's borders were illusions, and the heart of Rome could beat with an African rhythm. Rome thought it had conquered the world, but under Septimius Severus, the world began to conquer Rome. He didn't just sit on the throne, he redesigned it. From the moment he took power, he made it clear that the age of Italian emperors was over. The empire was now ruled by a man whose roots sank deep into African soil. The Senate wanted a puppet. Instead, they got a lion. And lions don't ask permission to roar. One of his first acts as emperor was to honor the place that had shaped him, Leptis Magna. The city that had raised him, once just another Roman outpost on the Libyan coast, became the empire's crown jewel. Under Severus, it bloomed like never before. Massive basilicas, marble plazas, towering arches, all carved with the precision of African craftsmen and the grandeur of Roman engineering. Imagine it, the Arch of Septimius Severus rising above the desert sand, its reliefs telling stories of conquest and glory, elephants, soldiers, and kings carved in stone, immortalized in African sunlight. It wasn't just architecture, it was a statement. Rome didn't build Africa, Africa had built Rome. He poured money into infrastructure, aqueducts, and harbors. Trade exploded. Gold and grain flowed out of Africa like a river of wealth, feeding the empire that once looked down on it. Even Roman nobles had to admit, under the African emperor, Rome prospered. But Severus didn't stop there. He had a vision of unity, not through bloodlines or birthright, but through merit and strength. For centuries, Rome had treated its African and eastern provinces like colonies. Under Severus, they became power centers. He appointed African governors, African generals, and even African philosophers to high office. To Rome's elite, this was blasphemy. To the empire's millions of subjects beyond Italy, it was liberation. His court was a crossroads of color and culture. Egyptian astrologers whispered in the halls, Nubian guards flanked the doors, scholars from Alexandria debated politics beside senators from Gaul. In Severus's Rome, skin tone was no longer a barrier to greatness. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and in that moment, the idea of empire began to change. Severus didn't just rule the empire, he made it African in spirit. He believed that civilization didn't belong to one race or continent. It belonged to those who had the courage to build, to dream, to conquer. And under him, Rome looked more like the world it ruled than ever before. But every empire has its cracks. For all his brilliance, Severus ruled with iron. He trusted soldiers more than senators, and steel more than words. His reforms made him beloved by the army, but feared by the elite. He expanded military pay, fortified the frontiers, and allowed soldiers to marry, a radical shift that transformed the Roman legions into families of loyalty, tied not to Rome but to him. That terrified the aristocracy, because when an emperor commands the hearts of soldiers, he no longer needs the Senate. His African roots became a political weapon used by his enemies to paint him as a tyrant, an outsider, an invader in their marble world. But Severus didn't hide from his heritage, he wielded it. When envoys mocked his complexion, he reportedly replied, "I am who the gods made me, and they made me emperor." It wasn't just a retort, it was prophecy. Rome's destiny, under him, stretched beyond the Mediterranean. Under Severus, the empire's borders reached their greatest extent since Augustus. He conquered the east, crushed rebellions in Mesopotamia, and expanded Roman influence deep into Africa. He didn't see a line dividing the civilized and the barbarian. He saw opportunity, and the world began to take notice. In temples and markets, in whispers and songs, people spoke of a new age, the African age of Rome. The emperor from Leptis Magna had proven that the empire's strength didn't lie in its Italian heart, but in the diversity of its veins. But empires built on power alone are fragile, and as Severus's glory spread, so did the seeds of his downfall. In the marble palaces of Rome, senators plotted. In the shadows of the empire, rivals stirred. And in the distant reaches of Britain, where cold winds whipped against the wall that marked Rome's edge, the emperor would soon face his final test, because every lion, no matter how mighty, must one day return to the dust. By the time Septimius Severus reached the windswept shores of Britain, he was no longer the young general from Leptis Magna. He was a legend, the emperor who had reshaped Rome, the African lion whose roar echoed from the deserts of Libya to the frozen frontiers of Europe. But in this distant, rugged land, his empire met its greatest challenge. The northern tribes of Caledonia, fierce, untamed, and unbroken, refused to bow. They had resisted every Roman who tried before him, but Severus wasn't like the others. He didn't come to negotiate, he came to conquer. Picture the scene. The year is 28 AD. The emperor arrives in Britain with an army of over 40,000 men, veterans from Africa, Syria, and Egypt, marching under the banner of Rome. The rain lashes against their armor, the mud clings to their boots, but their discipline is unmatched. Among them are Nubian archers, Moorish cavalry, and soldiers from the burning sands of the Sahara, now fighting under an emperor who shared their blood and their pride. Severus knew this campaign would define his reign. He wanted to secure the empire's northernmost edge and prove that Rome's reach had no limits. The ancient historian Cassius Dio wrote that Severus was most eager to subdue the whole of Britain, and he meant it. Where others had built walls, Severus built warpaths. He ordered the construction of massive roads through the forests and bogs of Caledonia, the kind that armies could march across for centuries. Even today, traces of his roads still scar the Scottish landscape, silent witnesses to an African emperor's ambition. But the north was a graveyard for empires. The tribes fought like ghosts, striking from the mist, then vanishing into the highlands. Severus's legions suffered ambush after ambush, their armor slick with rain and blood, and yet the emperor refused to retreat. No victory is won without struggle, he told his generals. He was nearly 60, his health failing, his body racked by pain, but he led from the front, wrapped in his dark cloak, riding through mud and storm. To his men, he was no distant ruler, he was a warrior king, a soldier of destiny. At night, the fires of the Roman camps burned through the fog, and in those flames, Severus saw more than a campaign, he saw a reflection of his life. He had risen from Africa's sun to rule the world, and now in this cold foreign land, he faced his own mortality. The rains grew colder, the resistance fiercer, the emperor's health worsened, but his resolve never broke. He told his sons, Caracalla and Geta, to continue the fight, to hold the line no matter the cost. But while Severus was fighting to expand Rome, his sons were already fighting to inherit it. The cracks within his family mirrored the cracks within his empire. Caracalla, ruthless and ambitious, wanted the throne now. Geta, quiet but proud, wanted peace. The emperor watched their rivalry grow, and knew that after he was gone, it would tear everything apart. Still, Severus pushed on. The campaign became brutal. He ordered villages burned, forests cleared, resistance crushed. Dio wrote that he slew many and ravaged the country. To Severus, it was the price of unity. To his enemies, it was vengeance from the heavens. The Caledonians eventually sued for peace, but peace was never enough for a man like Severus. He wanted submission, and yet fate had other plans. In 211 AD, weakened by illness and exhaustion, the emperor's body began to fail him. He was carried on a litter through the camp, still giving orders, still wearing his armor. The soldiers, many of them Africans far from home, wept as they saw their emperor, the man who had proven that Rome's greatness was not bound by color or continent, fading before their eyes. He summoned his sons to his side and spoke his final words: "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others." Then, in the gray chill of York, far from the golden sands of Leptis Magna, the African emperor of Rome died. But death did not diminish him. When news reached the empire, temples rang with mourning. Statues were raised in his honor from Egypt to Gaul. Even his enemies acknowledged his greatness. Severus had done the impossible. He had made Africa the beating heart of Rome. And as his body was carried back to the eternal city, wrapped in imperial purple, even the senators who once scorned him bowed their heads. The lion had fallen, but his roar would echo for centuries. When Septimius Severus died in the cold mist of Britain, Rome didn't pause to mourn, it braced for war. Because the empire he had built so fiercely now rested in the hands of two men who hated each other more than any foreign enemy ever could. Caracalla and Gaeta, sons of an African emperor, heirs to the mightiest throne on earth, yet brothers divided by jealousy, ambition, and rage. Their father's last words, "Be harmonious, enrich the soldiers, and despise all others," were meant as a warning. Instead, they became prophecy. Caracalla, the elder, was bold, impulsive, and violent. A soldier to his core, he had marched beside his father through the freezing swamps of Caledonia and believed he alone had earned the right to rule. Gaeta, the younger, was thoughtful, cautious, and loved by the people. He saw himself as the empire's diplomat, the calm to his brother's fury. But Rome couldn't have two emperors, and the sons of Severus couldn't share a shadow. When they returned to Rome in 211 AD, the city that had once celebrated their father's triumph now buzzed with rumors and fear. The Senate watched closely. The Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite soldiers, waited to see which son would feed them better. For a brief time, the brothers pretended to rule together. Coins were minted with both their faces. Edicts were signed in both their names. But behind the marble walls of the imperial palace, daggers were being sharpened, both literal and political. They divided the palace in two, refusing to eat, meet, or even look at each other. Servants were assigned to carry messages between them, like envoys between rival kings. According to Cassius Dio, they even plotted to split the empire, one ruling from the east, the other from the west. Their mother, Julia Domna, begged them to reconcile. She was the daughter of priests from Syria, a scholar and philosopher, who had guided Severus himself. But even her wisdom couldn't stop what was coming. Caracalla grew paranoid. He was certain Gaeta was plotting to overthrow him, and in truth, Gaeta probably was, so he decided to strike first. During the winter of 21, he invited his brother to their mother's private apartments under the guise of reconciliation. Julia, relieved, agreed. She stood between her sons as they approached each other for what she thought was peace. But as Gaeta stepped forward, Caracalla drew his sword. In an instant, the younger brother, the gentle, cautious one, fell to the floor, blood pooling at his mother's feet. Julia screamed, trying to shield him, but it was too late. Gaeta died in her arms. The floor of the imperial palace became a crime scene of family and empire alike. Caracalla didn't mourn. He ordered Gaeta's name erased from every monument, every document, every inscription. The Roman practice of damnatio memoriae, the erasure of memory. Anyone who spoke his brother's name aloud risked execution. Statues were smashed. Coins were melted. It was as though Gaeta had never lived. To the people of Rome, it was horrifying. To the army, it was power. Caracalla understood one thing his father had always known: the loyalty of soldiers was the key to empire. He showered them with gold, doubled their pay, and granted citizenship to every free man in the empire through his famous Constitutio Antoniniana. Overnight, millions became Romans. It was a political masterstroke, but also a desperate attempt to buy loyalty with silver and blood. Caracalla ruled like a warrior king, not an administrator. He donned Alexander the Great's image, calling himself his reincarnation. He waged wars against the Germanic tribes, then turned east to invade Parthia. He was brutal, unpredictable, but to his soldiers, he was one of them. Yet even the strongest lion can be hunted. In 217 AD, while traveling through the east, Caracalla stopped on the road near Carrhae to relieve himself, a moment of vulnerability that would end his reign. A soldier, seeking revenge for a brother Caracalla had executed, approached and stabbed him to death. The emperor fell in the dust, far from Rome, betrayed by his own guard. The empire he inherited through blood was taken by the same. Caracalla's death marked the end of the Severan dream. The African dynasty that had risen from Leptis Magna, that had ruled over the greatest empire in the world, was now crumbling under the weight of its own ambition. But its legacy, the image of an African emperor, his queen from Syria, and the idea that Rome was no longer the empire of a single race or continent, endured. For a brief blazing generation, Africa didn't just influence Rome, it ruled it. And though the Severan line ended in tragedy, it had already rewritten history. When the swords were sheathed and the blood of her son dried on the marble floor, Julia Domna did not weep in public. She ruled. The empress who had watched one son murder the other refused to vanish into mourning. Instead, she became the axis around which the empire turned. For though Caracalla sat upon the throne, it was Julia who held Rome together. Born in Emesa, in what is now Syria, Julia came from a line of sun priests, guardians of the god Elagabal, worshipped long before Rome's gods were even named. From childhood, she was surrounded by philosophy, ritual, and intellect. When Septimius Severus married her, it wasn't just for beauty, it was for destiny. Together they became a political storm, the African general and the Syrian scholar. Now, with her husband and one son dead, she stood as Empress Mother, a title heavier than any crown. Caracalla might have been emperor, but Julia was the mind that moved his reign. She attended council meetings, issued orders, corresponded with provincial governors, something no woman in Roman history had ever done so openly. When Caracalla marched east to wage war, Julia went with him, her tent pitched beside the generals. She studied the movements of the legions, advised on administration, and kept the empire's machinery from collapsing. Historians later called her Mater Castrorum, mother of the camps. She wasn't merely a queen in silk, she was the empire's strategist in sandals and dust. But beneath that iron composure was sorrow. Every letter, every coin bearing her son's image, reminded her of the one she lost. She couldn't erase the memory of Gita's final gasp or the blood that stained her robes. Still, she used that pain as armor. If the gods had taken her family, she would become divine in endurance. Julia turned to philosophy. She surrounded herself with scholars, thinkers, and writers. Her court became a gathering place for Stoics and Cynics, where discussions of fate and virtue mixed with the politics of empire. She read Epictetus and Seneca, repeating their wisdom to calm the storms inside her. We suffer more in imagination than in reality, but reality kept coming. As Caracalla's campaigns dragged on, whispers followed him. He had massacred the people of Alexandria for mocking him, slaughtered thousands in Parthia, and demanded divine honors as a living god. Julia's advisors warned her. His paranoia was spiraling. Then, one spring morning in 2017 AD, as the imperial caravan made its way through Mesopotamia, a messenger galloped into camp, dust and blood on his cloak. He brought word. Caracalla was dead, murdered by one of his own guards. Julia listened in silence. The world she had held together through grief and duty collapsed again. The new emperor, Macrinus, tried to sideline her. He ordered Julia to remain in Antioch, under watch. She was too dangerous, too beloved, too powerful to kill, but too intelligent to leave free. So they isolated her in a palace far from Rome, a gilded cage overlooking the Syrian hills. But Julia Domna was not built for quiet exile. She refused to live long enough to be forgotten. According to ancient accounts, she fasted for days, her body growing weaker as she dictated letters to friends, philosophers, and generals. Then one evening she lay down on a marble couch, covered herself in her imperial robes, and starved herself to death. It was not surrender, it was control. Her final act was to choose how and when her story ended. Even in death, she would not allow Rome to write her fate. Julia's death marked more than the fall of a dynasty. It was the fading of Rome's last golden matriarch, but her legacy refused to die. Her sister Julia Maesa and her nieces Julia Soamias and Julia Mamea would rise after her, pulling the strings of power from the shadows. From their bloodline would come new emperors, Elagabalus and Severus Alexander, both bound to Julia's memory and her will. The empire had lost its empress, but her family's reach was far from over. The women of Syria would soon step back into the light, wielding power sharper than any sword. For decades, Roman historians tried to paint Julia as manipulative, dangerous, or foreign, a woman too clever for comfort. But the truth is simpler. She was the empire's backbone during its most fragile hour. When men fell to ambition and betrayal, she stood. When her world turned to ash, she became its architect again. She was the bridge between Africa and Rome, east and west, reason and power, the last ember of an empire her husband built and her sons destroyed. And though her body was gone, her name became immortal, the shadow of the empress that still haunted Rome's marble halls.
When the Severans fell, Rome did not simply lose a dynasty, it lost its compass. The empire that had once been ruled by philosophers, jurists, and queens of vision descended once more into chaos. The army had tasted blood, and now it would not stop until it owned the throne. From 235 AD onward, emperors came and went like sand through fingers. 20 men in 50 years, each claiming divine right, each dying by the same sword that crowned him. Rome's marble heart cracked, but through those cracks came something extraordinary. The world beyond Rome began to rise. In Africa, the winds shifted. The province of Numidia, long the home of warriors and traders, grew powerful again. Carthage's descendants, the Berbers and Libyans, rebuilt their trade networks, weaving gold, salt, and wisdom through the desert routes that stretched from the Atlantic to the Nile. In Egypt, priests guarded ancient knowledge like fire under ash, keeping the mathematics, astronomy, and architecture that had once shaped the pharaohs alive in secret schools along the Nile. Rome still ruled, but only by name. The empire's reach had become brittle. Governors were warlords, taxes were ransoms, and the Senate was little more than a shadow play for generals. And through this chaos, one truth began to return: that power could come from the south, not just from Rome's cold north. On the frontier, whispers of African commanders began to spread. The legions stationed in Egypt and Severan were filled with soldiers of mixed heritage: Africans, Syrians, Arabs, all hardened by desert heat and foreign wars. Among them rose a man whose name would haunt the marble halls for generations: Philip of Arabia. Born in the small town of Shaba, deep in the Syrian desert, Philip was no senator's son. He was the son of a local chief, dark-skinned, shrewd, and fiercely ambitious. Through clever alliances and military brilliance, he rose through the ranks of the Roman army until fate handed him a chance no man from his lineage had ever been given. When the Emperor Gordian III was killed on a Persian campaign, Philip emerged as the new emperor. Rome, desperate for leadership, accepted him, but the Senate could never quite hide its unease. They called him Philip the Arab, sometimes in respect, often in contempt. They could not believe that a man from the desert, not from Rome, not from Athens, now ruled the empire. Philip, however, ruled with the same intelligence that had defined the Severans before him. He brought peace with Persia through diplomacy rather than endless war. He celebrated Rome's 1000th anniversary in 248 AD with games so grand they rivaled those of Augustus himself, and perhaps most radical of all, he tolerated the growing Christian community in Rome. Some even whispered that he had converted himself. It was a reign of uneasy peace, short, fragile, but visionary. Under Philip, the empire breathed again. For a moment it seemed the East had redeemed Rome once more. But history rarely allows men like Philip to last long. The legions of the Danube, jealous and hungry for power, raised another general against him, Decius, a hardliner who wanted Rome purified from Eastern influence. The two armies met in battle, near Verona. Philip was killed, his head paraded as a warning, and with his death, the dream of Eastern and African Rome faded back into the desert. Yet his legacy refused to die. The desert towns of Arabia and Africa remembered him not as a Roman emperor, but as one of their own, a man who had carried the world's greatest empire on his back and dared to lead it toward tolerance and peace. His image appeared in mosaics across Syria, and his reign marked the last true moment when the empire still pretended to be one, before it shattered into East and West. Meanwhile, in North Africa, something new was stirring. The descendants of Carthage's traders were becoming scholars again. In the libraries of Leptis Magna, the city built by Septimius Severus decades before, records of Roman governance mingled with Berber traditions, creating a new generation of hybrid leaders, fluent in Latin and Punic, Roman in law, but African in spirit. They looked at the empire's decay and saw not despair, but opportunity. As Rome stumbled, the provinces learned to stand alone, and soon Africa would no longer be a province. It would be the empire's last beating heart. By the middle of the 3rd century, Rome's economy was crumbling, its frontiers breaking, and its faith in itself eroding. But from the deserts of Syria to the dunes of Libya, The memory of the Severans and of Philip burned like an ember. They had proven something no general or emperor from the north could erase, that Rome's greatness was never confined to its city walls. It was born in the diversity of its empire, in the strength of its outsiders, and in the genius of those it once called foreign. The next rulers who would come, Diocletian, Constantine, and later Theodosius, would all draw from that legacy, often without admitting it. Because what the Severans and Philip had done was not just rule Rome, they had redefined it. They had turned the empire from a city-state into a global civilization, bound not by race or birth, but by vision. The fall of the Severans may have dimmed the eastern sun, but it did not set it. From the ashes of that dynasty and the rise of Philip's desert crown, the idea of Rome began to shift. No longer a European empire, but a Mediterranean one born from Africa, the East, and the sands that connected them both. And as the empire lurched toward its next transformation, the question that haunted the Senate would echo through history: who truly ruled Rome, the men in marble, or the blood from the desert? By the late 3rd century, while Europe was choking on war and famine, Africa was alive. The desert still burned, but its cities thrived like jeweled oases. Carthage, Leptis Magna, Alexandria, once outposts of empire, had become the new Rome in spirit and strength. The old capital might have the Senate, but Africa had the scholars, the grain and the gods. Grain was gold, and the African provinces controlled it all. From the fields of Numidia to the delta of the Nile, ships carried wheat to feed the empire's starving masses. Without Africa, Rome starved, literally, and everyone knew it. Governors in Carthage began to hold power that rivaled generals. They collected taxes, commanded legions, and negotiated trade deals with eastern kingdoms. Rome could issue decrees, but in the south, they were treated more like suggestions. For centuries, Africa had been the empire's granary. Now it was becoming its brain. The torch of knowledge that had once burned in Athens and Alexandria flickered but never died. In hidden chambers and temple schools, the ancient Egyptian sciences, astronomy, medicine, mathematics, were preserved and expanded. Philosophers of the Nile whispered ideas that would later feed into Christian theology and even Islamic scholarship centuries later. One man stood at the center of this rebirth: Tertullian of Carthage. A fierce thinker and master of Latin, he turned Rome's own language into a weapon of truth. When philosophers in Rome debated the nature of law and divinity, Tertullian was already a century ahead, fusing African logic with Roman rhetoric to form a new way of thinking: Christian humanism. He coined the term Trinity. He challenged the empire's gods. And he did it not from Italy, but from Africa's coast. After him came Cyprian, Bishop of Carthage, a man so powerful that even emperors wrote to him with caution. When the empire persecuted Christians, Cyprian led the resistance. When plague hit, he organized aid, medicine, and burial, acts of mercy unheard of in Roman politics. Rome had generals, but Africa had shepherds. It was here, not in Rome or Constantinople, that the intellectual backbone of Western Christianity was born. And as faith spread, so too did the African influence behind it. By the time of Augustine of Hippo, the African Renaissance had reached its height. Augustine's city of God would later shape the medieval mind, influence popes, reformers, and even philosophers of the Enlightenment. But few remembered that Augustine, the man who defined Western theology, was an African from modern-day Algeria. Meanwhile, the cities around him were miracles of light and learning. Alexandria still had its scholars and astronomers. Carthage hosted markets that rivaled Constantinople, and Leptis Magna, the jewel of Libya, shone with marble streets and archways built by African emperors long dead, their memory etched into the stones. Here, statues of Septimius Severus still stood, nose intact, crown polished, inscription proud. In Rome his legacy was uncomfortable. In Africa, it was sacred. The Severans were not ghosts here, they were ancestors. But beyond the libraries and basilicas, something else was rising, a new kind of unity. For centuries, Rome had divided its people by birth: Roman, African, Greek, Syrian. Now, under the weight of crisis, those lines blurred. Soldiers from the desert stood guard over Italian cities. Scholars from Carthage debated senators from Gaul. Africa had become Rome's last bridge between cultures, between continents, between gods. And in that fusion, a quiet revolution took shape. The African provinces began to see themselves not as Rome's servants, but as its saviors. When emperors fell, African governors restored the trade. When barbarian raids crippled the north, African ships filled the grain depots again. When the empire's heart faltered, Africa's pulse kept beating. The empire that had once conquered the continent now depended on it. Even the emperors noticed. When Diocletian restructured the empire around 284 AD, he looked south. He split the empire into 4 parts, but made sure that Africa had its own seat of power, not under Rome's shadow, but beside it. He knew what the Senate refused to admit, that Rome's survival rested on African stability, and in the following century, that truth only deepened. When Constantine the Great rose to power and legalized Christianity, he inherited a faith forged in Africa. He built churches with blueprints, born from Carthage, and sermons echoing Augustine's words. He adopted symbols from Egypt, the cross ink, the sun disk halo, and turned them into imperial emblems. The African Renaissance had quietly reshaped the empire's soul. But as light rises, so too does shadow. Wealth attracted envy, knowledge invited theft. Rome's new power brokers, now based in Constantinople, began to drain Africa again, stripping its art, taxing its cities, and erasing its names from history books. The African fathers of philosophy were renamed. Their statues were relocated or destroyed. Their contributions attributed to anonymous Roman scholars. It was a second conquest, not by sword, but by silence. Yet the legacy could not be buried, because the foundation of Europe's future, its theology, its architecture, its science, had been built in Africa's hands. When the libraries burned, their scrolls traveled in hearts and minds, carried by students, monks and traders, who would later seed the Renaissance in Europe. Africa had given the world light once more, and even when Rome fell, the echoes of that brilliance would return, centuries later, under new empires and new faiths. For now, as the 4th century dawned, the African sun still burned bright. Rome's emperors had come and gone, but the Nile still flowed, the scholars still wrote, and the legacy of the pharaohs, the Severans, and the saints all merged into one unbroken chain. The empire had changed, but its center, its heartbeat, had moved south.
By the 5th century, the empire that once boasted of ruling the known world was bleeding from every border. The Rhine was overrun, Britain abandoned, and the once golden city of Rome trembled under the boots of barbarian armies. Often dies, while Europe fell into darkness, Africa still glowed. Its fields produced grain. Its scholars still taught philosophy. Its faith still pulsed strong through monasteries along the Nile and libraries in Carthage. For a fleeting moment, it seemed the sun had not set. It had simply moved south. The Roman emperors of this late age were emperors in name only. The real power rested in the provinces, and Africa had become their last refuge. Governors in Carthage and Alexandria
began to rule like kings. They collected their own taxes, built their own armies, and passed laws Rome could no longer enforce. Even as the Senate argued over shadows, ships from Africa still brought food to Italy's starving coastlines. Rome's empire was dying, but Africa was keeping it alive. Yet every empire has its reckoning. In 429 AD, a new power crossed the sea, the Vandals, warriors from the north, pale-skinned and hungry for gold. They swept into Carthage like a storm, looting the palaces and burning the archives. But what they found wasn't weakness, it was resistance. African soldiers trained under Roman command fought back with ferocity. For years, the deserts and coastal plains burned with rebellion. Even when Carthage fell, its people didn't break. They adapted, surviving under new rulers while preserving their knowledge and traditions in secret. The Vandals ruled the land, but the Africans ruled time. Deep in monasteries, monks copied manuscripts by candlelight, works of science, theology, and history first written by men like Augustine, Tertullian, and earlier Egyptian priests. The libraries of Rome might crumble, but the ideas lived on in Africa's hands. It was in these hidden places that the continuity of civilization survived. And when the empire in the east, Byzantium, tried to reclaim Africa, they didn't find savages. They found a people still fluent in Greek, Latin, and Coptic, a society that remembered how to build aqueducts, run markets, and debate philosophy. The Byzantines came to conquer, and instead rediscovered the last memory of Rome's greatness. But as centuries passed, something older began to stir, something that had never truly died. The spirit of the pharaohs, buried beneath marble and Latin, began to whisper again. When Arab armies arrived in the 7th century, they didn't find a dead world, they found living cities. They found scholars in Alexandria, still studying the stars. They found temples that had become churches, churches that became mosques, all standing on the same sacred ground. They found continuity, not collapse. The conquerors came expecting to erase, but instead, they absorbed the science of Egypt, the philosophy of Carthage, the medicine of the Nile. In time, those African ideas would travel once again, east into Arabia, then north into Europe, reborn under new names. Historians call it the Islamic Golden Age, but its foundation was already African. When Baghdad's scholars translated Greek and Roman texts, many came not from Athens, but from Alexandria. When European thinkers rediscovered Aristotle, they were reading words preserved by African scribes. Even the concept of the university, a center of learning, built around debate, discipline, and divine study, was modeled on the teaching traditions of Carthage and Hippo. The empire had fallen, but the African mind endured. It was never dependent on marble palaces or golden statues. Its wealth was knowledge, and knowledge could not be burned. The irony is painful. Rome claimed to have civilized Africa, but when the dust settled, it was Africa that had civilized the remains of Rome. The West forgot that truth. Of course, when European kingdoms later rose from the ashes, they rewrote the story, calling themselves the heirs of Rome, pretending that the torch of knowledge had been passed from Caesar to Charlemagne without interruption. But the real keepers of that torch were monks in the Maghreb, mathematicians in Egypt, and poets in the Sahel, who still sang of their ancient empires. Every empire that followed, Byzantine, Arab, European, borrowed from Africa's unbroken line of genius. By the Middle Ages, the ruins of Leptis Magna and Carthage were half buried beneath sand, but travelers from across the world still came, astonished at the remnants, the massive arches, the intricate mosaics, the engineering unmatched even in their time. They asked, "Who built this?" And the locals smiled. They said, "Our ancestors." Those ancestors were the pharaohs who ruled Rome, the emperors, bishops, generals and scholars of African descent, who had shaped the empire's greatest centuries. Their names had been scraped from marble, but their work remained carved into the bones of civilization. Even now, fragments of their legacy survive. The Latin liturgies of the Catholic Church trace back to African bishops. Roman law owes its rational framework to jurists trained in African academies. Architecture from France to Spain echoes the domes and columns first perfected along the Nile. Even the word civilization itself carries the echo of cities that once stood in Africa's deserts. The empire might have forgotten its roots, but the earth never did. As the last Roman banners fell, a new sun rose over Africa, the same land that had fed empires, educated saints, and crowned emperors. The cycle had come full circle. The wisdom of the pharaohs lived on, passed from generation to generation, transforming with every tongue that spoke it. Africa had been Rome's foundation, and when Rome collapsed, the foundation remained. Because history doesn't end where power fades. It continues in whispers, in stories, in buried temples and living bloodlines. Rome may have fallen, but the pharaohs who ruled it still reign in the memory of every civilization that came after. Their crowns were broken, their names erased, but the truth, carved in stone and written in stars, still stands. Africa was never Rome's possession. Rome was Africa's legacy. The empire Severus built stood on the edge of triumph and tragedy. He had done what no emperor before him could. He ruled Rome not as a foreigner desperate to fit in, but as an African who reshaped it in his own image. Yet as his legions marched north, through the mist and mud of Britain, the greatest battles he faced weren't against the barbarians beyond the wall. They were within his own bloodline. The winds howled over the Scottish moors, whipping the emperor's cloak as he watched his two sons, Caracalla and Gaeta, ride ahead of the troops. They were born of power, raised in marble halls, and destined for crowns. But where Severus was forged by struggle, they were shaped by privilege. He had hoped to pass to them not just an empire, but the discipline and wisdom that built it. Instead, he saw rivalry festering where unity should have lived. Caracalla, the elder, was restless, fierce like his father, but impatient, cruel where Severus was strategic. Gaeta was the opposite, thoughtful, calculating, and cautious to a fault. Together they were the twin faces of ambition, reflections of a father who had once believed he could control destiny itself. As the war in Britain dragged on, so did the war between his heirs. In the damp camps along Hadrian's wall, soldiers whispered that the brothers barely spoke. At meals they sat apart. On the march, their legions competed for glory, and Severus, old and weary, watched it all from a gilded tent filled with the scent of desert incense, a reminder of home. He coughed more often now. The weight of the empire pressed heavier each day, and with every breath he took, the line between victory and collapse blurred. One night, as thunder rolled over the northern plains, Severus called his sons into his tent. The empire was sleeping, but his voice carried the edge of eternity. "Be good to each other," he said. "Enrich the soldiers, and despise everyone else." It was advice only a man forged in Rome's corruption could give, half wisdom, half warning. He knew the Senate would never love his sons. He knew that once he was gone, Rome would test them the way it had tested him, and he feared they would fail. The next morning, the emperor's chariot rolled toward the front lines. The campaign was brutal, and though victory loomed, his body was giving out. The soldiers adored him, the African general, who led from the front, who slept on the ground beside them, who paid them well, and treated them as brothers. But as his strength waned, so did their hope. They carried him on a litter through the cold fog until, one day in 211 AD, the Lion of Africa finally lay down his crown. He died in York, not in Rome, not in Libya, but on a battlefield far from the sun that had raised him. When word spread through the legions, men wept. Even the roughest centurions bowed their heads. For decades, they had followed him through deserts, mountains, and storms, and now the empire itself seemed to stop breathing. Caracalla and Gaeta took his body back to Rome with great ceremony. The streets that once doubted the African emperor now overflowed with mourners. Draped in gold and crimson, his coffin passed through arches he himself had built, monuments of stone whispering his name back into eternity. But the peace he had fought for did not last. Barely months after his funeral, Rome was soaked in blood again, not from invaders, but from family. Caracalla, unwilling to share power, invited his brother to a supposed reconciliation in their mother's arms. Gaeta came, believing there might be peace. Instead, soldiers loyal to Caracalla drew blades and cut him down in front of her. The emperor's tent was replaced by a palace of treachery. Rome's walls, once fortified by Severus's unity, cracked under his son's betrayal. Caracalla ruled alone, haunted by his father's ghost. He expanded the empire's citizenship, opened doors to foreigners, even to Africans, but his cruelty burned bridges faster than his laws could build them. He was the emperor who carried Severus's name, but none of his balance. Rome had gained a conqueror and lost a builder. Yet even as Severus's bloodline tore itself apart, his legacy refused to die. The African emperor had left more than monuments. He had left an idea that Rome's greatness was not born from bloodlines or skin, but from brilliance and will. In the shadows of the Senate, young men from the provinces whispered his name with pride. In Leptis Magna, his city blossomed, new arches rose, temples flourished, and his people still walked among the mosaics he had laid. The marble told a story the writers could not erase. Years later, when Caracalla himself fell to the blade of betrayal, the empire turned again to Severus's example. His dynasty, known as the Severan line, ruled Rome for decades after his death. For the first time in history, Rome's imperial family was not purely European. It was African and Syrian, a fusion of worlds that terrified the old elite, but reshaped the future. From the sands of Libya to the halls of the Palatine, Severus's shadow lingered. Every general who dreamed of power, every outsider who walked into Rome with fire in their eyes, they carried a piece of him. The Black Caesar who rose from Africa had taught the empire a lesson it could never unlearn. Greatness has no color, and power has no origin but courage. And though marble fades and lies are carved deep, truth always finds its way back through the cracks.
When Septimius Severus died, most believed the story of the African emperor had ended with him, but they were wrong. His blood still pulsed through Rome's veins, not only through his sons, but through the women who would wield the empire's power with the precision of a general and the patience of a queen. At the center of it all stood Julia Domna, Severus's wife, born in Emesa, modern-day Syria, into a priestly dynasty that worshipped the sun god Elegabal. Her skin was olive, her eyes deep and sharp, her mind sharper still. In Rome she was called Mother of the Camps, because she didn't sit idly in palaces while her husband marched. She traveled with him, across deserts and frontiers, through Britain's mud and Africa's sand. Julia Domna ruled beside Severus as his equal. When he died, she didn't fade into mourning. She became the quiet architect of the empire's survival. Caracalla, their eldest, may have worn the crown, but Julia Domna held the empire together. Senators came to her chambers, seeking counsel. Generals deferred to her judgment. Even the legions whispered that the empress's word carried the weight of command. She funded schools, restored libraries, and gathered scholars from every corner of the empire to debate philosophy and science. In her circle, Greek thinkers argued with African mathematicians, Egyptian priests with Persian astrologers. To her, Rome was not a city, it was a network of minds. But power in Rome never stayed unchallenged for long.
Caracalla's reign was soaked in paranoia. He saw enemies in every corner, including his mother's advisors. Yet even he could not escape her influence. When he marched east, conquering cities and spilling blood, Julia Domna rode behind him. When he fell, assassinated on the road in 217 AD, she was still there, calm as marble, the only constant in an empire that had devoured her family. They say when she heard of her son's death, she refused to eat. She locked herself in her tent and read philosophy until her final breath. But even in death, Julia Domna's story didn't end, because the dynasty she built refused to fade. Her sister, Julia Mesa, stepped out from the shadows to claim what Rome thought it had stolen. A Syrian woman of African lineage, through the Severan bloodline, Mesa had learned from her sister's brilliance and her brother-in-law's cunning. Where Julia Domna ruled through intellect, Mesa ruled through intrigue. When the empire descended into chaos under the usurper Macrinus, Julia Mesa saw opportunity. She returned to her home in Emesa and raised the banner of the Severan legacy. With gold, charisma, and the loyalty of the Eastern legions, she presented her grandson, Elagabalus, the teenage priest of the sun, as the rightful heir of Septimius Severus. And the legions, still loyal to the memory of the African emperor, rose for her. They marched on Rome. Within months, Macrinus was dead, and the Severan dynasty was restored. But what returned was no ordinary imperial family. It was something Rome had never seen before. The throne was now surrounded by women from Africa and Syria, women who spoke with accents. The Senate mocked, but feared, women who wore foreign jewels and prayed to foreign gods. Rome's marble heart beat to a different rhythm now, one that echoed across deserts and temples far from the Tiber. Elagabalus's reign was chaos, eccentric, decadent, and short-lived. He worshipped his god openly, clashed with the Senate, and scandalized Rome with his defiance of their customs. But behind every strange rumor was the same quiet truth. The empire was still ruled by women of color, still bound to the African-Syrian dynasty that Severus had begun. When Elagabalus was overthrown, Julia Mesa struck again. She replaced him with her younger grandson, Severus Alexander, who ruled with greater restraint. Mesa's daughter, Julia Mamia, guided the young emperor, effectively ruling in his name. For nearly half a century, women of African and Syrian heritage controlled the greatest empire on earth, through wit, patience, and survival. And though historians later reduced them to footnotes, their fingerprints are everywhere. The laws they influenced protected philosophers and scientists. The architecture they funded blended Roman marble with Eastern design. The trade routes they secured stretched from the Sahara to the Indus. And the intellectual life of the empire, the very spirit of debate, of art, of science, flourished under their shadow. Yet when later European historians retold Rome's story, they stripped these women of their power. They became consorts, advisors, mothers, never rulers. Statues of Julia Domna were repainted pale, her features softened, her intellect dismissed. Julia Mesa was called a schemer, a manipulator, never a strategist. Even their religion, the worship of the sun, was mocked as superstition, when in truth, it was the same faith that would later inspire the iconography of Christian halos. But history remembers what the marble forgets. In the ruins of Leptis Magna, in the mosaics of Emesa, in the surviving texts of their scholars, their influence glows like a buried ember. Together, these women did what few men ever could. They ruled an empire not by sword or birthright, but by intelligence and will. And when the last Severan fell, Rome itself began to crumble. Because when the African and Eastern dynasties were erased, Rome lost its balance, its link to the diverse, brilliant world that had made it great. Before long, emperors became soldiers again. The Senate lost its teeth, and the empire slid toward collapse. It was as if the gods themselves turned their faces away the moment Africa and the East were written out of history. But the story doesn't end there. because long after the Severans fell, their legacy lived on, in art, in religion, and in the bloodlines of Rome's future rulers. And it all began with an African man, and the women who refused to let his empire die. When the Severan dynasty ended, Rome began to unravel, not with a single collapse, but with a slow grinding loss of memory. The last emperor of their blood, Severus Alexander, was murdered by his own soldiers in 235 AD. The generals who came after him fought not for the empire, but for the throne itself. Within decades, Rome was no longer ruled by visionaries. It was ruled by mercenaries. The heart that had once beat with the rhythm of Africa and the East grew cold, mechanical, forgetful. But the echo of the Severans didn't vanish. It drifted, through art, through religion, through legend, reshaping the world in quiet, invisible ways. Because history doesn't truly die when the marble cracks. It lingers in whispers, in symbols carved too deep to erase. The memory of Africa in Rome's shadow. In the centuries after Septimius Severus and Julia Domna, the empire fractured into chaos. Civil wars split provinces apart, plagues gutted cities. The economy buckled under its own weight. Yet even in that darkness, the traces of their reign refused to fade. The African legions that Severus raised continued to fight on the frontiers, defending the empire he built long after his death. The walls he restored in Britain stood for generations. Soldiers stationed there still prayed to African gods, their shrines littered with carvings of the sun, the lion, and the eagle intertwined. In Leptis Magna, his hometown, the city glowed one last time. Its arches and forums, carved from golden limestone, survived centuries of sandstorms. Travelers from across the Mediterranean came to see the African Rome, a city so refined that even ruins of its markets outshone the capitals of Europe. But the scholars who chronicled that brilliance began to shift the story. When Roman historians of later centuries, writing under Christian emperors, retold the past, they softened the edges. They called Severus stern, foreign, ambitious to a fault. They questioned his origins, debated his complexion, diluted his legacy. They erased Julia Domna's intellect, Maisa's political genius, Mamaea's rule, because by then, Rome's power had moved north, and its memory followed. Europe was rewriting itself, and to justify its new dominance, it needed to believe that civilization was born from pale marble, not from the dark stone of Africa. White marble, black erasure. When the Renaissance dawned 1,000 years later, Europe resurrected Rome, but not the real Rome. The artists and scholars of Florence and Paris sculpted Caesar and Augustus, studied Latin and Greek, rebuilt cathedrals in Roman form, yet they filtered the empire through a single lens, whiteness. They polished statues until their pigments disappeared, forgetting that ancient sculptures were once painted in vibrant color, brown skin, dark eyes, red lips, and gold ornaments. They called it purity, but what they really created was amnesia. In that new Europe, Septimius Severus was a problem. The idea of a black emperor, born in Africa, ruling the eternal city, did not fit the mythology they wanted to sell, so they buried him under footnotes. When his portraits were found, they described him as dusky. When his coins resurfaced, they called his features stylized. In museums, his busts were displayed under bright white lights, his African lineage omitted from the plaques. Julia Domna was recast as Syrian-born, her identity sanded down until it was palatable. Even Leptis Magna was ignored, left to the sands. The greatest city of Africa's Rome, lost to time because it told the wrong story. But history has a strange way of resurfacing. The return of the forgotten empire. In the 19th and 20th centuries, as archaeologists dug into the ruins of North Africa, they found traces of something Europe couldn't explain away. They uncovered mosaics of African nobles dressed in Roman armor, inscriptions that named senators and engineers with Libyan and Nubian ancestry, tombs that blended Latin epitaphs with Egyptian symbols. They unearthed portraits of Severus himself, with skin tones unmistakably dark, hair tightly curled, and eyes carved with the depth of desert ancestry. The truth that scholars had tried to bury for a millennium stared them in the face. Rome was never just European. It was African, Asian, and Mediterranean, a symphony of civilizations, and at its height, the empire had been ruled by a man whose roots lay in the very continent Europe later enslaved. That revelation shook the foundations of history itself, because if Rome, the supposed cradle of Western civilization, had been ruled by an African emperor, what did that say about the myths of European supremacy? If the heart of empire had once pulsed with African blood, what did that mean for the centuries of colonization that followed, built on the lie of civilizing the savage? It meant the narrative was inverted. The teacher had been the student all along. Echoes in faith and myth. Even as Europe erased the names of its African rulers, their symbols survived, hidden in plain sight. The Severan dynasty's devotion to the sun god Elagabal eventually morphed into the Christian symbol of the halo, the radiant circle behind saints and saviors, echoing the solar crown once worn by African priests. The idea of divine light surrounding a holy figure was not born in Rome's temples. It came from Africa and the East. Julia Domna's patronage of philosophy planted seeds that would later bloom in medieval monasteries. Her scholars preserved Greek and Egyptian knowledge in scrolls that traveled from Syria to Alexandria, from Alexandria to the libraries of Al-Andalus, where African and Arab scholars would one day rekindle Europe's mind in the Renaissance. And the very concept of the universal empire, the dream of unity under law, culture, and spirit, that was Severus's vision, not Augustus's, not Constantine's, Severus's. He, the African emperor, believed that Rome could be more than a city, that it could be a mirror of the world itself, a world not ruled by race or religion, but by brilliance and strength. The irony: Europe inherited that dream, but forgot its source. The fall of Rome, the rise of memory. When Rome finally fell, not with fire, but with forgetfulness, it wasn't just armies that brought it down, it was arrogance. When it erased Africa from its story, it severed itself from its foundation. For centuries, the descendants of the Severans world lived on, in Berber dynasties that ruled the Sahara, in Nubian kingdoms that held back Arab conquest, in Moorish scholars who built the libraries of Spain. The empire had fallen, but Africa's intellect kept the flame burning. And when Europe eventually emerged from its dark age, it did so by rediscovering the very knowledge that Africa had preserved: astronomy, medicine, architecture, mathematics, all born from the continuum of civilizations that Rome had once united under the Severan line. So when you stand in front of the Colosseum today, or trace your fingers along the broken columns of Leptis Magna, remember this: that stone doesn't belong to one continent, it belongs to all of them. And beneath the cracks, the African fingerprints remain. The legacy of the Black Caesar's Septimius Severus was not a myth. He was not a token or a footnote. He was the emperor who redefined power, who rose from the sands of Africa to command the armies of the world. Julia Domna and Julia Mesa were not just wives or mothers. They were rulers, strategists, philosophers, architects of empire. Their legacy isn't just carved in stone, it's embedded in the DNA of modern civilization, in the languages we speak, the laws we follow, the architecture we build, the philosophies we teach. Rome, for all its glory, was never purely European. It was the child of Africa, and that's the truth that terrified generations of historians, because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know that the empire of marble was built on foundations of obsidian, the myth of Western civilization cracks open, revealing the brilliance beneath. A new dawn today. Scholars, artists, and filmmakers are reclaiming this buried legacy.
In classrooms, the story of Severus and the Severans is being told again, not as an anomaly, but as proof that Africa has always been at the center of the world's history. Leptis Magna is rising again, not through conquest, but through recognition. Tourists walk its arches and see the craftsmanship of Africans who mastered engineering when Europe was still a frontier. In Rome's museums, portraits once labeled North African are being re-examined with honesty. DNA studies confirm what the stones have whispered all along, and a new generation, from Lagos to London, from Tripoli to Atlanta, is rediscovering the truth that empires tried to erase, that greatness has no color, that civilization was not gifted to Africa, it was born there. Epilogue: the throne beneath the dust. In the final years of his life, Severus returned to Britain, ill and weary from war. Standing on the misty walls of York, he looked over a landscape that felt nothing like the sands of his youth. They say he told his sons, "Keep the soldiers rich, the rest don't matter." But what he left behind mattered far more than gold. He left an empire reshaped by Africa's mind and soul. He left cities that still stand. He left the proof that power, intellect, and empire were never bound by race. And though the centuries buried his name under marble dust, his story rises again, like the desert sun that first lit his crown. Because you can shatter statues, you can rewrite scrolls, you can whitewash stone, but you can't kill memory. The pharaohs who ruled Rome are rising once more, not as conquerors, but as reminders that Africa was never the margin of history. It was history, and now the world is finally remembering.